All right, welcome to Advancement Tech Episode 7. Let me just take a few seconds here to make sure that things are working. Make sure chat is working. Okay, so this episode is Should You Use Open Source Software? My name is Kristen Jameson, and this, again, is Advancement Tech Episode 7. So things seem to be looking good. So I welcome you to join me in the chat. So I'm monitoring chat, so if you have questions, I will look over periodically to see if you've mentioned something. We are live streaming on YouTube, so you will need to have a YouTube account or a channel to be able to chat. So you're welcome to do that if you'd like to. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So welcome, thank you for attending. First, I'm going to mention a little bit of a background about myself, and then we have about 15 to 20 minutes of education on our topic, and then we're going to have a Q&A period. Okay, so who am I? My name is Kristen Jameson. I've worked at 2 different universities over a period of 12 years. I oversaw development and advancement services while working for those universities. Since then, I founded a company. I developed a product called Advancement Form that does online giving and event registration. Okay, so we're talking about open source software. So first start with the definition. Sorry, it's kind of lengthy, but and this is from Wikipedia, it is a type of computer software in which source code is released under a license. So let's talk about this. What is source code? Source code is computer code that you use to write programs in. So what language that is used to create those programs, that source code is released under a license in which the copyright holder grants users the rights to study, change, and distribute the software to anyone and for any purpose. So normally when someone writes something, even a computer program, there's a copyright attached to it. And there are certain licenses that say, okay, anybody is free to, again, it mentions here, study, change it, and redistribute it. Now, there are certain licenses that have some different restrictions with regard to it, but we're going to look at some reference information with regard to that. Now, open source software may be developed in a collaborative public manner. So by open source, that means the source code is open for people to see and for potentially to make changes in it. And a lot of open source software is actually developed collaboratively over the internet. So it's basically a community project that developers from all over the world are contributing and building software together. It's not any one company, it's not any one group of individuals, but it's a group collaboratively working together. Now contrast this with closed source software. That means you cannot usually see or access the source code. Another term for this is basically it's proprietary. So again, the definition from Wikipedia is that this means computer programs whose source code is not published, so it's kept private within the company usually. The source code is not shared with the public for anyone to look at or change. Most companies who sell their software for money make it closed source so people cannot easily change it or copy it for free. So most companies, when they develop software, they're developing closed source. However, there are some companies that sponsor open source projects, and then sometimes they offer an enhanced version that has a fee attached to it that maybe has some closed source component to it, or maybe they offer support programs to provide support for that open source software. Okay, so this is just a little table that I drew up, the difference between open source and closed source. So open source, generally it is free. It is free to acquire. You can just basically download it, install it, and start using it. Whereas closed source, generally, there's a cost to acquire it. You have to pay a company or a vendor for that software. Open source is typically free to now, this is all typically or generally. There are exceptions, but this is kind of the general rule. So open source, it is free to share. So once you have that, you can actually share it with someone else with no ramifications. Whereas usually closed source software or proprietary software, you're usually explicitly prohibited from sharing it in the license agreement that you generally sign or agree to when you're purchasing software from a company. Open source, you can see and alter the source code to actually change how the program works. Whereas the closed source, generally you're prohibited from seeing or altering the source code because you don't have access to it. They give you the programs, but you can't access the source code behind it. And open source is typically developed collaboratively by developers across the world, given the particular project. Whereas closed source is generally developed by individuals that haven't released it or companies that are using it to potentially sell. Okay, so whenever you're talking about open source software, you definitely want to take into account licensing considerations. So these are some of the major licenses that you'll see. One is known as the GPL or the GNU General Public License. There's the BSD license, was a little bit more freer than the GPL. There's also the Apache license and the MIT license. So if you're determining a particular software to use, you would probably, if you have legal counsel available, you may want to consult them on what makes the most sense for your organization, or you can look at some of these licenses are relatively short and you can pretty much examine what they mean. Now, a good source for this of the different licenses that are available is actually the opensource.org site. So if we go to this, so they have this page here, licenses, and it talks about all the popular licenses that are used in open source software, and you can actually click on it and get more information. So if you're interested in looking at what the licensing is typically for open source software, you can consult the site. Okay, now we're going to talk about some different types of open source software that are available, and I kind of lumped them into two different buckets. One is general personal productivity software that you would typically install on a machine to use locally. And then from an infrastructure perspective, something that maybe is generally installed on servers. So if you have responsibility for managing servers or that type of infrastructure, we'll talk about that. Okay, so in terms of personal productivity, one area that you typically see open source software is operating systems. And I'll mention these now, but then we're going to drill into each one in future slides. But operating systems are basically what enables you to run your computer and install software on it. So Microsoft Windows, Apple Mac OS, those are two different operating systems. We're going to look at office productivity software. So this could be Google's apps. This could be Microsoft Office. Those are closed source examples, but we'll look at some open source ones. So for example, office productivity would include things like a word processor, spreadsheet, presentations, or drawing capabilities, database, small database systems. There's also web browsers, email clients, calendar systems, so things that generally work on the internet for collaboration. There's a set of software for doing image editing, sound editing, as well as video editing and production. So this is kind of a general thing that areas that we'll talk about and look at some examples. However, pretty much any software that you would want to use on your computer, there's probably an open source alternative. All right, so let's look at operating systems. So generally when you go buy a computer, it will have Microsoft Windows on it or the Apple Mac OS if you're buying a Mac. However, there are shouldn't say free, a lot of them are free, but there are open source software alternatives to these operating systems. One of the most popular ones is Linux, and two examples of it are Ubuntu and Fedora. So there are two different variants of Linux. There's also FreeBSD, so it's another variant that is Linux-like. So to take a look at this, so Ubuntu is located here. Now, when you go to a site like Ubuntu, you can see the focus is not necessarily on the desktop, and they're appealing to enterprises because the Ubuntu operating system, or Linux, basically does a lot of server jobs on the internet. So you'll see enterprise listed here, developers, people are developing code, but you can use it for general use. Now, usually when you're going to buy a computer, it's going to have Microsoft Windows installed on it or Apple Mac OS. However, there's nothing stopping you generally when you buy a Windows computer to install Linux on it if you want it. Actually, that is what my work computer uses. So 95% of the time I am using actually Ubuntu Linux as my desktop. Now, again, when you buy a computer, you generally have the operating system come with it, like Windows. However, if you are looking to reduce licensing costs, then maybe you are setting up a bank of computer systems for like doing automated calling or something of that nature, maybe you would want to potentially try an open source alternative for software if you don't have enough licenses for Microsoft Windows. But this is just an alternative. And just to look at some screenshots, here's an example of a screenshot of Ubuntu. And it has a quick bar where you can access all of your applications on the left. It has a desktop that you can place items on. This is akin to the start menu, and when you click on it, it shows you the different applications that are installed on it. And generally, when you install Ubuntu, there's a whole host of free applications it comes with. So you can see there's a Firefox web browser. This is Office productivity software. Kind of you name it, there's usually a piece of software that you can use to operate the computer. And similar to Ubuntu, another popular one is Fedora. And again, their focus is on workstations, which they tend to be developers, their server software, and some other products. But Fedora is another project that uses Linux that you can use for your operating system. Okay. Now, apart from operating systems, and I've mentioned free software with it, a lot of this free software I'm discussing, you can find it on Linux, but you can also find these free software alternatives. A lot of them work on Microsoft Windows and even Mac OS as well. So you can investigate that. But let's jump into Office productivity. Now, for example, this would be like your Microsoft Office or your Google Apps. However, there are two primary open source alternatives that I'm aware of. One is LibreOffice and then Apache OpenOffice. So in terms of LibreOffice, which comes bundled with Ubuntu, for example, the Ubuntu Linux operating system, it has a word processor, which the Microsoft equivalent, which is like Microsoft Word, but they call it Write. It has a spreadsheet. Microsoft calls theirs Excel. LibreOffice calls it Calc. Similar to presentations, where it would be Microsoft PowerPoint, they offer the product called Impress. In terms of graphics, so these would be vector graphics where you're using circles and triangles and squares to be able to develop an image akin to Adobe Illustrator. They provide an application called Draw. And then lastly, in terms of having a small database system, Microsoft has Access, whereas theirs is just simply called Base. So just to look at some images here. So this is a writer, and you can tell it's a lot of the same feature set for being able to develop what you would in Microsoft Word or Google Docs. Again, the spreadsheet that is offered here called Calc looks similar to Excel or other spreadsheet products. And similarly, Impress is a slide application for doing presentations. And again, it's a lot of the same features that you would find in Microsoft PowerPoint or other types of presentation software. And this is the website for LibreOffice. And you can find all sorts of information about it. And I will include all of these links in the show notes so that you can find where the different software is located. All right. Okay, so let's look at web browsers, emails, and calendars. So basically internet connectivity software. So in terms of web browsers, There is Mozilla Firefox. So you can install that on pretty much any operating system, and you can use Firefox as an open source browser. There's also Chromium. Now, Chromium is actually the open source version of Chrome. It's kind of, that is built up, and then Google adds additional things to Chrome. But this is an open source alternative that you could use if you so choose to. In terms of email clients, now these are ones that you can connect up to talk to an email server. There's Mozilla Thunderbird that generally comes with Ubuntu. And there are also some different calendar products. Mozilla has something they called Lightning Calendar, and then just a base application called Calendar comes with Ubuntu. So again, there's free software alternatives for pretty much any piece of software that you're looking for. Now, in terms of image editing, the most popular one that I'm familiar with is called GIMP, or the GNU Image Manipulation Program. Now, this would be an alternative to, for example, Photoshop. So here's the website for GIMP, and it classifies itself as the free and open source image editor. And it talks about its high quality photo manipulation, artwork creation, and graphic design elements. And it even talks about some other free software you may want to use to incorporate into your what they're calling a desktop publishing workflow. So these are some additional free software programs that you can acquire to kind of add additional features and make a full workflow out of it. Now, apart from image editing, let's look at sound editing. So here there is Audacity. So Audacity, they're classifying as a free open source cross-platform audio software. So again, a lot of the software works on Windows, Mac OS, and even Linux. That's the little penguin icon is their mascot, essentially, is the Linux mascot. So this allows you to do editing and recording of audio if you have need to do that. So in terms of video editing and production, two of the, I would say, the biggest software solutions with regard to this are Blender. Now, Blender started out, and it's still its main focus, is a 3D creation suite. So this is kind of like an alternative to paid solutions called 3ds Max or Maya, if you're used to working with that. But it also can do video editing. So if I've seen some reference that it does a really good job at this. I haven't used it personally, this video editing solution, but I'm personally am going to be checking it out at some point here. Now, in addition to 3D creation and video editing, there's also the open broadcast software known as OBS. So this does broadcasting of your computer. It can broadcast cameras, it can do screen recording. Essentially what I'm running right now is actually OBS. So if I look here, this is actually the open source software. So what I'm delivering to you now is I'm using open source software to do it. Again, that's what so many people that are live streaming or broadcasting today, they are using the OBS software. And going back to the one I mentioned, so you have Blender, which has, again, all the capabilities for doing 3D creations, as well as doing video editing, and then OBS in terms of the open broadcast software. And again, it works on the three main different operating systems that you're familiar with, has the features for doing the broadcasting. Okay, so those are some examples of some productivity. If you are watching right now and you're curious on other types of software you use to see if they're free alternatives, feel free to type it in the chat and I'll look at it during the Q&A period. All right, but let's move to infrastructure. So pretty much a great majority of the internet, I would say, runs on open source software developed collaboratively where the source code is open. And I have a few examples here I'm going to run through of different infrastructure components that are open source. So number one are the operating systems. So many of the servers that run the internet are using open source software such as Linux or FreeBSD. Databases are another source of open source software. So in terms of relational databases, the paid for versions would be Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server. However, there are tons of other databases that are being used that are open source. So PostgreSQL is definitely an up-and-coming open source database and has been around quite a while. There's MySQL, which is another relational database. These two are relational. Redis is actually a in-memory database that usually stores things by keys and values. And then MongoDB, which is thought of kind of as a document database. So it's not relational, but it kind of stores information into a document-based format. And all of these are open source software. The next are web servers. So again, the vast majority of web servers are open source, and they're using either the Apache web server or another web server called Nginx. Pretty much the other major web server I'm familiar with is Microsoft's Internet Information Server, or IIS. That is a proprietary one, but these are open source that actually the vast majority of the internet uses. If you're using a content management system, for example, to run your website, most of those are open source programs. So for example, WordPress is open source software, Drupal, Joomla. So a lot of the major ones are using open source software. And then network infrastructure, a lot of the network infrastructure, again, is using open source software. Okay, so if we take a look, like for example, the product that I developed, Advancement Form, that does online giving and event management, so much of the solution is built on top of open source software. So, the infrastructure we run it on uses the Linux operating system. We use the PostgreSQL relational database, as well as the Nginx web server and different open source software to deliver our solution. So much of it is built upon open source software. All right, so getting back to the original question is, should you use open source software? Well, the main appeal of it essentially is that it's free. You can basically just go to it and you can download it, install it, and start using it. You do need to, again, take into consideration the licensing restrictions that may be there or your organization may have with how you intend to use it. But essentially, you can go get it, install it, and start using it. Now, nothing is really free, but so there are costs to doing a transition. So for example, whenever you get new software, you're going to have to spend time learning it. And what is the ramp up time to learning it? Like if you are using screen recording software such as Camtasia maybe, and you're maybe want to try using OBS for that, there's a ramp up time to actually learn how to do that. Or if you are using Photoshop and want to move to GIMP, there's a ramp to understand how that software works. Now, in a lot of this open source software, because it's developed collaboratively, and there's a lot of times no one organization driving it. There are in some cases, but it may not be as feature rich as some of the other software that you're accustomed to using. And it may even be not as, or it may be a little bit more clunky or a little bit different from how you're used to working. Not necessarily, but it depends on what kind of software and how many people are supporting that particular program as to how mature a product it is. So it's just some evaluation that you'll have to do. And that goes back to the potentially less usable. If it's lacking certain features or maybe they're a little bit more clunky, then the costs of using that software may be a little bit higher in terms of training and understanding it. But that's not always the case, definitely. Now also, when you install free software, you're talking about what about support? If you need support from a purchased product, you can generally contact the company, send them an email, give them a call, depends on if you have a support contract with them. what do you do about free software, open source software? Well, generally, there are companies that offer support contracts for what you're interested in. So, for example, Ubuntu, they offer a support contract for their desktop operating systems and their server operating systems. Or in the case of PostgreSQL, maybe you can find there are different companies that provide support contracts for helping you manage your database. But even desktop applications, I'm sure you can find training materials for that particular software that you're interested in. So that's just something to keep in mind. So there is a lot of benefit to using it, but you just have to be cognizant of the costs involved. All right, so at this point, time for questions. And if you have any questions, feel free to just type them in the chat and we will address them. Now, while I wait to see if there are any questions, I'll talk about upcoming shows. So the next show coming up is what is conversion rate optimization? So it's basically, an acronym for this is CRO. It's basically how can you optimize the conversion rate of different, usually forms you're using. So how do you improve the conversion rate of people wanting to make a gift or people wanting to attend an event or filling out a survey? What are some techniques you can use to hopefully increase the percentage of people that convert into whatever activity you're asking them to do? And again, the show is happening next Friday, March 15th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, in terms of the future, I'm interested in hearing what you would like to hear about. So please feel free you can type it in the chat or you can leave a comment in this YouTube video and we can talk about what you want to find out more about. All right, I don't see any questions right now, so we will go ahead and close this out. If you want to get notifications of when videos have been released and when the live shows are, again, our live shows are 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time every Friday, and we do send out the replays for those episodes. If you want notifications with regard to that, please visit advtech.tv, and you can go ahead and put in your email address to receive those episodes when they come out. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, it would be great if you could give this video a like and potentially subscribe, because we are looking to grow the number of people that are participating and watching the show. Other than that, I think we are done, and I will see you next Friday.